Lady Louise Windsor had spent years mastering one of the monarchy's oldest survival skills: silence. She rarely stepped into public controversy, never competed for attention, and guarded her feelings about Queen Elizabeth with almost sacred privacy. But that silence shattered when Louise delivered one devastating sentence about Camilla, words so personal, so direct, and so impossible to soften, that even those standing nearest her seemed unsure how to respond. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Louise stood inside a private Windsor family reception held after a small commemorative event linked to Queen Elizabeth's legacy. A commemorative event is a gathering created to honor the memory, service, or influence of someone who has died. Edward and Sophie were nearby. Charles and Camilla were present, and several senior relatives had remained for the quieter family discussion afterward. That setting mattered because the room carried two competing realities at once: the memory of the late Queen and the authority of the current one. Louise had never been known for palace confrontation. Her deliberate distance from internal rivalries made her words heavier when they finally came. During a tense exchange about younger royals publicly embracing Camilla's position as queen, Louise answered with complete clarity, "Camilla will never take Queen Elizabeth's place in my heart." The sentence landed without anger, but its calmness made it sharper. She was not challenging a title, she was protecting an emotional boundary. Camilla did not answer immediately. The Queen's expression tightened as she looked toward Charles, then back at Louise. This was not a dispute about precedence, meaning the formal order in which royals are ranked or positioned. It was about memory, affection, and whether a new role could ever demand the same place in someone's heart. Edward instinctively shifted closer to his daughter. He did not rebuke her, and Louise understood the gesture instantly. Charles noticed it too. Sophie looked less surprised than anyone. The trusted confidant had already sensed how deeply the issue was affecting Louise, and had warned others that pushing emotional equivalence between Camilla and Elizabeth would backfire. Louise had been carrying the sentence for days. Earlier conversations had made her feel as though accepting the Queen's public role also required reshaping private loyalty. That was the pressure she could no longer tolerate. Camilla finally asked why Louise felt the need to say it so directly within the family. Louise did not retreat. She told her that the problem had started weeks earlier, during an incident Camilla may have assumed she had forgotten. And to understand why those 14 words carried enough force to freeze an entire royal room, one must first understand what Queen Elizabeth had meant to Lady Louise long before Camilla ever became queen. Saved for all upcoming sections, I'll prioritize faster delivery, and slight variation above or below the word target is fine. For Lady Louise, Queen Elizabeth had never been merely the sovereign whose face appeared on coins, portraits, and state occasions. She had been Grandmama, the steady figure who encouraged a shy child without demanding that she perform for the monarchy. That distinction matters, because Louise's statement was never born from a debate over titles. It came from the far more dangerous territory of love, grief, memory, and the fear that something irreplaceable was being quietly rewritten. Louise carried memories of Windsor, Balmoral, and smaller family gatherings with a tenderness that public ceremony could never fully explain. Balmoral is the royal family's private Scottish estate, long associated with informal family time, away from official duties. Elizabeth had treated her granddaughter less like a future royal asset and more like a quiet young woman who needed confidence on her own terms. Prince Philip deepened that connection. Louise's passion for carriage driving, a sport he loved deeply, became a private bridge between generations. After Philip died, those shared memories made her even more protective of both grandparents. Louise accepted the constitutional reality without resistance. Charles had become king, and Camilla had taken her place beside him. Succession is the formal process by which the crown passes from one monarch to the next, and Louise never questioned that order. What troubled her was something more personal. She began sensing that people expected emotional loyalty to move as neatly as constitutional authority. To her, Affection could not be transferred with a title. Sophie noticed the change before anyone else. Whenever conversations compared Elizabeth and Camilla, her daughter grew quieter. During one private exchange, Sophie asked whether she was angry. Louise answered that she was not angry yet. She was frightened. She feared the family was beginning to treat strong remembrance of Elizabeth as if it somehow challenged Charles. Sophie heard the pain beneath those words and understood this was no ordinary adjustment. Camilla noticed the distance too. The Queen interpreted Louise's emotional reaction whenever Elizabeth was mentioned as resistance to the present. Louise experienced it as grief. Charles saw the issue differently again. The king believed visible unity around Camilla helped stabilize the monarchy, while his niece increasingly felt that unity was becoming a demand placed on private emotion. Louise eventually sat with a framed photograph of Elizabeth and Philip, running her thumb slowly along its edge. She told Sophie that nobody should ever ask her to replace that feeling. Sophie said nothing at first. Then she simply sat beside her. The conflict was not born during the Windsor reception, it began earlier, in a carefully planned ceremony, where one seemingly simple request crossed a line Louise had never expected anyone to challenge. Every royal rupture has a point of no return, and for Lady Louise, it came not during an argument, but during a ceremony designed to symbolize harmony. The request sounded harmless when it was first explained. There would be photographs, a commemorative display, a few younger family members standing beside the king and queen. Yet buried inside those arrangements was one symbolic instruction Louise could not accept, and once she understood what was being asked of her, everything changed. Louise arrived at Windsor 3 weeks before the later confrontation, expecting a quiet family ceremony about continuity between generations. A commemorative display is a formal arrangement of photographs or objects created to honor people, events, or periods of royal history. Younger relatives had been invited to stand with Charles and Camilla beside a presentation meant to represent the modern monarchy. Then Louise noticed what had changed. A framed photograph of Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip, originally placed prominently near the family group, had been moved farther away, so the arrangement centered the current king and queen. Louise asked an aide whether the photograph could be returned before the official family picture was taken. She had also been instructed to stand directly beside Camilla. The aide explained that the layout had already been approved. Louise did not argue, but her discomfort became impossible to hide. Then Camilla entered and heard enough of the exchange to understand what was happening. Louise asked her directly whether she had known about the change. The Queen answered that the ceremony was meant to look forward, not backward. For Camilla, it was about presenting the current reign clearly. For Louise, the words sounded like her grandparents were being pushed into history before her grief had caught up. Sophie stepped in quietly. She told organizers that her daughter should not be forced into symbolic gestures that caused real emotional pain. Her objection was acknowledged, but nothing changed. That told Sophie the decision had come from higher authority. Louise later learned that Charles himself had accepted the layout because he wanted the imagery to emphasize the present reign. The discovery hurt in a different way. She loved her uncle, yet she could not understand why moving forward seemed to require moving Elizabeth farther away. Louise made her choice seconds before the photograph. She stepped away from the assigned position beside Camilla and moved closer to Edward. The shift was small, but everyone noticed. Camilla noticed most of all. No accusation was spoken, but the gesture carried one unmistakable message. Louise would not allow her private grief to be arranged for appearance. So when Camilla challenged Louise at Windsor, she was not confronting a sudden rebellion, she was reopening a wound that had already been quietly deepening for weeks. The first shock was Lady Louise's statement. The second came when everyone realized she had no intention of apologizing for it. Royal families survive difficult moments through carefully chosen words, softened meanings, and private corrections. Louise offered none of those escape routes. When Camilla asked whether she understood how hurtful her remark sounded, the young royal met her gaze and explained exactly what she meant, turning an uncomfortable family exchange into an unmistakable confrontation. Charles remained seated, while Edward and Sophie stayed close to Louise. Camilla stood opposite her, and the silence around them became almost oppressive. Constitutional rank means a person's formal place within the royal structure, and Louise made clear that she understood that difference perfectly. When the Queen asked whether she was refusing to recognize her position in the family, Louise answered without hesitation. She was not questioning the title, she was defending the feelings attached to someone else. Louise's voice trembled slightly when she finally said it. "I know who you are. I know your title. But you cannot ask me to feel for you what I felt for Grandmama." Camilla's jaw tightened. She did not interrupt. The Queen had spent years fighting for acceptance, and hearing those words inside the family felt like a rejection of something she believed had finally been settled. Louise did not look away. Camilla answered that she had never asked anyone to erase Elizabeth. Louise replied that the pressure had not always come through direct commands. People around the Queen had repeatedly acted as if loyalty to the present required reducing the emotional importance of the past. Camilla pulled a chair back but did not sit. She gripped the top rail, while Louise explained how the earlier Windsor ceremony had made her feel that her grandmother's memory was being repositioned for convenience. Charles finally intervened. The king told Louise that nobody was trying to replace his mother. She answered respectfully, but firmly, that the ceremony weeks earlier had made her feel exactly that way. His expression changed when she added that she knew he had approved the altered presentation. The argument suddenly became more personal for him. Edward then stepped forward, in a way nobody expected. He told Charles that Louise should never have been placed in a position where supporting the current monarchy appeared to require emotional distance from Elizabeth. Sophie remained beside her daughter, reinforcing the message without adding another confrontation. Charles ended the exchange before anger hardened further. But the matter was not finished. Almost immediately afterward, he requested a private conversation with palace advisors about how the ceremony had been handled and who had pushed Louise so aggressively. Louise had finally spoken from the heart, but her words now entered a world governed not only by feelings, but by hierarchy, image, and the quiet machinery of royal power. What looked like a quarrel between Lady Louise and Camilla quickly revealed something more complicated. Behind the emotional clash stood advisors, image strategies, and a campaign to present the monarchy as fully settled under Charles and his queen. Louise had not simply resisted one photograph. She had disrupted a carefully managed message. And when Charles began asking who had approved the pressure placed upon his niece, the answer created a new problem inside the palace. Charles entered the private briefing, expecting a simple explanation, and found a strategy instead. Communications advisors had been trying to create stronger visual continuity around him and Camilla, especially during family occasions involving younger royals. Visual continuity meant presenting the monarchy in a way that made the current king and queen appear firmly accepted across generations. Louise mattered because of her closeness to Elizabeth and Philip. A warm photograph beside Camilla could be used as powerful proof that the younger family had emotionally embraced the new order. Charles learned something else that disturbed him more. Louise had raised concerns before the ceremony, and those objections had been minimized rather than properly passed upward. The king removed his reading glasses, placed them on the table, and asked why nobody had told him his niece was distressed. He had approved the broad presentation, but he had not understood the emotional pressure surrounding it. That distinction mattered, because Charles suddenly realized his authority had been used to support decisions he had never examined in full. Sophie made the point even harder to ignore. During a private conversation, she told Charles that her daughter was not a prop for public reassurance. The trusted confidant kept her voice controlled, but her anger was unmistakable. Louise had spoken quietly the first time. She should have been listened to then. Charles did not argue. The review also complicated Camilla's responsibility. She had supported the idea of looking forward, but not every instruction came directly from her. Advisors had expanded that broad message into specific staging choices because they believed they understood what the Queen wanted. In trying to strengthen Camilla's position, they had done the opposite. Louise's resistance exposed how insecure forced symbolism could appear. Charles acted quickly. He struck a line through a proposed family photo arrangement for another engagement, and told an aide that no younger relative would again be positioned for symbolic purposes without consultation. The order protected Louise immediately. It also sent a message through the household. Affection could not be manufactured. The palace machinery adjusted within hours, but the emotional damage moved much faster, and Camilla was about to discover that Louise's words could not be contained within Windsor's walls. For Camilla, the most painful part was not that Lady Louise loved Queen Elizabeth more. Nobody expected otherwise. The wound came from hearing that distinction spoken aloud at precisely the moment when she had spent years trying to inhabit a role defined by another woman's 70-year reign. Louise's words exposed the boundary Camilla could never cross. A crown might be inherited by circumstance, but affection could not be commanded, and by evening, that truth had become impossible to ignore. Camilla watched the room empty while senior staff were quietly instructed to keep the confrontation inside a tightly controlled circle. Upcoming briefing materials were also revised, with language about younger royals embracing the new era removed before it could create another problem. A briefing note is an internal document used to guide royal appearances, talking points, and public messaging. The Queen understood what those edits meant. The palace was already retreating from the language that had helped create the conflict. Louise returned to the family rooms with Edward and Sophie, and the adrenaline began to disappear. She still believed every word she had said, yet certainty did not protect her from guilt. Sophie found her standing near a window, visibly shaken. Louise admitted she had never wanted to humiliate Camilla. She only wanted people to stop asking her to turn grief into approval. Sophie stayed close, reminding her that honesty could still hurt, even when it was necessary. Camilla remained with Charles after everyone else had gone. She finally asked the question beneath all the anger. Did everyone secretly believe what Louise had said? The king answered carefully. Elizabeth could never be replaced, he told her. But that did not make Camilla's own service meaningless. The queen listened, then made an admission she had avoided for years. Part of her had always known comparison with Elizabeth was unwinnable. Trying so hard to escape that shadow, she confessed, may have made the family feel she was trying to erase it. Charles refused to turn Louise into the problem. When advisors suggested asking her for a softened clarification, the monarch rejected the idea. Forcing his niece to reword a genuine emotion would make the family appear frightened of honesty. Camilla did not challenge him. Later, Camilla picked up a prepared schedule describing her role at an upcoming Elizabeth Remembrance event. She read it once, folded the page, and set it aside. For the first time, she questioned whether occupying more space would actually strengthen her position. The next morning, she made an unexpected request. She wanted to speak to Louise privately. No Charles, no Edward, no Sophie, no advisors. After days of royal positioning and family tension, the conflict was finally stripped of titles and strategy, leaving only two women, one painful sentence, and the memory standing between them. The meeting that changed the direction of the crisis contained no advisors, no palace statements, and no carefully arranged family photograph. Lady Louise entered expecting another demand for explanation. Camilla entered, carrying something far more difficult, the knowledge that defending her title would solve nothing. For the first time since the dispute began, both women faced each other, without the monarchy acting as a shield, and what Camilla said next transformed anger into something Louise had not expected. Camilla invited Louise into a small sitting room at Windsor and asked the aides to leave once tea had been placed between them. A sitting room is a private space used for informal conversation rather than official ceremony. And that mattered because neither woman wanted another exchange shaped by rank or staff. Louise prepared herself for an apology request. Instead, the Queen told her she wanted to understand what the earlier ceremony had made her feel. Louise hesitated, then finally answered without softening it. Louise explained that Elizabeth and Philip had made her feel valued without expecting performance in return. They had encouraged her quietly, and that memory had become one of the safest parts of her life. Seeing their photograph moved aside had frightened her because it made grief feel inconvenient, as if love for the past had suddenly become something that needed to be managed. Camilla listened without interruption. Camilla finally answered with more vulnerability than Louise expected. "I was never asking to be her." The Queen admitted that she had sometimes allowed advisors and her own insecurity to blur the difference between being accepted in her role and being loved as Elizabeth had been loved. Louise heard something important in that confession. Camilla was not asking to win the comparison anymore. She was admitting it had never been winnable. Louise said she was sorry her words had caused pain, but she did not retract them. Camilla surprised her by saying she should not. What mattered now was preventing other people from turning private emotions into symbols of loyalty or rejection. The Queen then revealed a change she intended to make. At the next family commemoration for Elizabeth, she would step back from the center and allow the late monarch's grandchildren to take a more visible role. Camilla placed the previously moved photograph of Elizabeth and Philip on the table between them. Louise looked at it, then back at her. Neither woman needed another explanation. The gesture carried enough meaning on its own. Inside Windsor, the wound was beginning to close. Outside its gates, the sentence had already become a headline, and Britain was about to decide what it believed Louise had really said. By the next news cycle, Lady Louise's private declaration no longer belonged only to the royal family. It had become a public argument over memory, succession, loyalty, and the impossible task of following Queen Elizabeth II. Some saw cruelty toward Camilla. Others heard only the honest grief of a granddaughter refusing to let protocol dictate affection. Then one newspaper front page captured the entire conflict in a single image, and suddenly the palace understood how deeply Louise's words had landed. Louise woke to find fragments of the Windsor Exchange spreading across royal coverage before the full wording was reproduced. Succession is the formal order through which the crown passes from one monarch to the next, but the public debate quickly moved beyond that structure. Commentators focused on the difference between constitutional position and personal devotion. Palace officials refused to issue an aggressive denial. Instead, they stressed that family affection and official roles were separate matters, making clear that Charles had no intention of punishing his niece for expressing grief. Louise felt overwhelmed when she saw the headlines at breakfast. Edward stayed close and reminded his daughter that she could not control what strangers turned the sentence into. She could only decide whether she had meant it honestly. Louise admitted that she had. That truth did not make the attention easier, but it stopped her from wishing the words away. Camilla faced the opposite pressure. Aides showed her some of the harsher commentary, but the Queen refused to respond publicly. Her private conversation with Louise had changed the calculation. Defending herself against a granddaughter's grief would only make the conflict look like a competition for affection. Camilla understood that silence, for once, was stronger. Then came the front page that gave the controversy its emotional symbol. A fictional national newspaper published an old photograph of a young Louise laughing beside Elizabeth beneath the headline, "She was my queen first." Near Windsor Castle, visitors left flowers beside tributes connected to the late monarch. Several handwritten cards carried the same message in different words. Remembering one queen did not require attacking another. Charles watched a broadcaster describe the dispute as the difference between inheriting a role and inheriting love. The king remained silent for several seconds, switched off the television, and told Camilla that perhaps the family had needed to hear exactly that distinction. She did not argue. The controversy had begun with a sentence about who could never replace Elizabeth, but it would end only when the family finally admitted that replacement had been the wrong idea from the beginning. In the end, Lady Louise's words did not destroy Camilla's place within the monarchy. They did something more important. They defined its limits. Elizabeth's place in her granddaughter's heart was not a position waiting to be inherited, transferred, or modernized. It was permanent. And once the family stopped treating that truth as a threat, the confrontation that had seemed capable of dividing them became the moment that finally allowed memory and the present to exist side by side. Charles turned that understanding into a clear household decision. Future family commemorations would separate honoring Queen Elizabeth's legacy from supporting Camilla's present role. A family commemoration is a private or official gathering held to remember someone's life and service. The king made it clear that younger relatives would not be expected to prove loyalty to the current monarchy by pretending their emotional relationship with Elizabeth had somehow been transferred. Louise would face no forced apology, no public correction, and no private punishment. Camilla changed course in a way that mattered more than any statement. At the next remembrance gathering for Elizabeth, the Queen deliberately allowed Louise, Edward, Sophie, and other descendants to stand closer to the memorial display, while she remained slightly apart. Camilla did not appear weakened. She appeared secure enough to stop competing with memory. Louise noticed immediately. She looked toward the older woman and gave a small, deliberate nod. It was not surrender. It was recognition. Charles later spoke privately with Louise. The monarch told his niece that his mother had belonged differently to every member of the family, and he admitted that preserving the crown could never mean controlling those memories. Louise became emotional, but answered simply that this was all she had wanted understood. For the first time, Charles recognized that succession transferred responsibility and authority, not love. Camilla reached the same conclusion from another direction. She no longer needed to chase comparison with Elizabeth, because refusing that comparison gave her something stronger, an identity of her own. She could be Charles's queen without becoming his mother, and Louise could respect her without pretending that grief had been rewritten. Louise later returned the photograph of Elizabeth and Philip to its familiar prominent place. Camilla walked past, paused, gently straightened the frame, and continued without moving it aside. Louise watched in silence. That small gesture carried the entire resolution. Lady Louise never took back her words because she never needed to. Queen Elizabeth kept her permanent place in her granddaughter's heart, while Camilla finally found something stronger than replacement, a place of her own. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.